Never going to get used to that.
I know, it's so weird.
I think is that that idea, as well as doing stuff that no one will see, it's completely at odds with our kind of philosophical makeup, in not just in contemporary in the social media age, but the idea of most monotheistic religions that have afterlives that are kind of dependent on your actions in the present. That or most of your actions, are for a greater personal good. So I think that we're kind of, and then we're adding on to that with social media and having displaying the totality of your life for external consumers. I think this idea of doing stuff that no one's ever going to see or know about is difficult for a lot of people to comprehend in any real way, because even if you do something like changing your shopping habits, that's easy to Facebook or tweet about, whatever. So I think that would be interesting if that could actually manifest in any way across people who are so used to doing things for their own personal greater good.
I think something you need to sort of juggle with is, why are you sharing it? So for example, like using the same instance of changing your shopping habits, are you sharing that because you want other people to be able to access this independent maker, or maybe someone who's local and it's an underrepresented person, being able to sell their work? Are you trying to promote them, or are you trying to praise yourself? And I think it's always the why that should be considered rather than the what, because there is value in sharing a lot, but there's also room to be cynical around that sharing.
I feel like with the whole, people's fear of being called like a performative ally, I feel like the more you do behind the scenes, like no one needs to know that. And if someone thinks you're being performative, because as well as that you're like posting things on social media, if you know you're doing that, then I guess like that doesn't refer to you, so it shouldn't really bother you. I think if someone calling you performative like hits a nerve, maybe that is because it's performative. But if someone says that and that that's not the case, because that it's something that you're including in every kind of part of your life, then it just really shouldn't bother you if someone thinks that of you.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
I think also going back to sort of your question around like the personal sacrifice, I think it needs to be thought of in a broader sense rather than just, oh, I'm not allowed to do this anymore. I think you need to realize that part of the sacrifice is like unlearning and teaching yourself things. So it may be down to language or how you approach people or what it is you're considering. But I think people see personal sacrifices, if we go back to like the Blackout Tuesday thing, it's like, I'm not allowed to post today and that's my sacrifice. It can't be that shallow. There needs to be depth to it. And I think that's where the sort of optical activism comes into play, because it's like, what else are you doing? Like, what other steps can you be taking? And I think you have to be challenging yourself, and that's the real sacrifice.
I think with personal sacrifice as well, I saw a snippet of a talk a little while ago. I'll try and find it. People might have seen it. It was talking about the use of the N-word in lyrics and whether white people could sing along with that. And the black speaker talked about white entitlement and the fact that white people feel like they should be entitled to say things and do things. I think that idea of personal sacrifice and people being like defensive against that it comes from that white superiority and that white entitlement that they've just not recognized at all. And I think it's just really trying to educate people on that seems to be key, to be like, you've been entitled to so much, and kind of dictate that kind of what like language and dictates government and so many things, just kind of that education. And particularly I think the education that was in the podcast as well, I know we'll talk about that later, but that kind of talk about empire, I think, is really, I think these interlink in a really interesting way, about that kind of privilege and the fact, the idea of personal sacrifice being so hard for some white people.
Yeah, that's a really good point as well. I'll just quickly move on to the other talking point just before we go on to the next one, but just because I thought this was kind of an interesting question. But basically, so she talked a bit in the article about how to talk to your family and friends about racism, and a question that like came up for me, which is something that I've kind of confronted in. So like the activism that I've done before has been more like, I basically have done some like animal rights activism before, and I read a book about it, and it was interesting because it came up like there's a debate about whether when you're trying to, so let's say for the context of this, when you're trying to convert people, like convert racist people to being anti-racist, like whether you should slightly dilute your views in order to make them more palatable, so that people who are sometimes stuck in their ways and stubborn can understand them more, or whether you should stay kind of uncompromising and you know, because obviously in terms of Black Lives Matter conversations and anti-racist conversations, these are, you know, people's lives are obviously at stake here, so there's obviously a massive argument for saying that you should not be in any way forgiving or compromising in your dialogue about it, but I guess there's another argument to say that you can kind of take a more gentle approach in order to like for the not that you feel like you want to do that yourself, but you know, in order to convert people in a more realistic way. But I just was interested to know what people's thoughts were on that point in terms of speaking to family members and friends and things like that.
Not so much in the context of family, but I think that's the whole kind of internal, that encapsulates the internal debate around the nomenclature around white privilege. This idea that the critical race theorists didn't get it wrong in what it describes, but the lack of pragmatism within the word. It's a phrase. It's a phrase that you can dismiss so easily because of you know the obvious arguments that we all heard, and so I think there is something for pragmatic approaches, and I think that normally the criticisms of those kind of pragmatic approaches, which we'll talk about when we talk about race and class later sessions, are mainly rooted in this kind of need to be seen as radical as possible, but which is really at odds with the ultimate goal. And this goes back, you know, we could talk about Jeremy Corbyn being an imperfect vessel for socialism in the UK because of his lack of pragmatism, and because, you know, he wouldn't have the kind of capacity one needed at that point to be that kind of figure in that historical juncture, because he could not sell something that really did need to be sold. I think you could make the same argument about anti-racism, about needing to make it appealing. Because the goal isn't to, you know, appease your friends who agree with you. It's to convert those who need it, who require it.
I want to throw a spanner in the works and say that I don't really have time for people who are more offended from being labelled racist than actual racism. People like Piers Morgan, who, instead of dealing with the reasons why some people might label them as racist, focus on the fact that you've labelled them as racist, and that's the issue. Monroe Bergdorf lost her job with L'Oreal because what she said true. We can all see right now that it's true. But because people didn't like the way she said what she said, they didn't want to listen. So I agree that there's space for pragmatism, but I feel like that's just one way of white supremacy trying to control the way that you protest and the way that you deal with racism, to say that, oh, if you said it this way, we'd listen more. Oh, if you did it this way, we'd listen more. The message is what it is.
Do you not think there's a difference between a Piers Morgan and, you know, someone who themselves just kind of repelled by a certain phrase that they think is at odds with their experience? because there's always going to be the opposition who will twist anything, like a Piers Morgan, or the 10 people waiting to take his place. I think there's a difference between, especially when we're talking about working class coalitions, and uniting wider marginalized groups. There is definitely space for pragmatism without the kind of needing to appease like the likes of Piers Morgan.
Personally, I think that due to all the subconscious racist training we all undergo, there are 3 types of white people: actively racist white people, people who are actively trying to become anti-racist, and white people who don't want to deal with any racism that they might hold, but also everything that they do works to maintain the systems that benefit them. So whether you're the type of white person who you have black friends, you believe that we have the right to vote and that we shouldn't get killed, but you also believe that we should pull ourselves up from the bootstraps. Maybe if we didn't listen to music that was so aggressive, maybe if we didn't talk with our hands, maybe if we didn't have these certain hairstyles. You're different. You're 2 sides of the same coin to Piers Morgan, really.
I agree with you completely, but it's really frustrating that you have to sort of juggle that with getting people to listen to you, and maybe you do have to tone yourself down and make yourself more palatable. And I completely understand why someone will just say, no, fuck that, like that's not what I'm going to do and that's not what I'm about. I think you do need those people, but there has to be a few people in the middle that will be listened to, and I don't think they should be the ones who are listened to, but that's how it is more effective.
I don't think it's as I don't think it's like a strict dichotomy. I don't think it's about not saying that the UK is racist, or that all white people are racist. I just don't think there's anything particularly radical about saying that. I think it's much more radical about making a nuanced argument that engages people and that can penetrate people's bigotry. And, yeah. and I think that's the point I'm trying to make. It's not about toning down. It's about making a good argument. And you don't make a good argument by just kind of throwing everything out at the same time and kind of making a statement that is going to get the Twitter sphere riled up. It's about being nuanced and giving a deeply complicated and complex issue the kind of rhetoric it deserves.
I definitely agree with that. Like, I think if I've got a friend who generally is like on board and would consider themselves to be anti-racist, and then maybe they say one thing and it might be something that would be considered a bit more nuanced, and if that's something that we can have a conversation about. But then there's if I'm having a conversation with like a family member who is kind of further along the scale, it would completely alienate them, and I think it just like wouldn't get through. And like, it's such a shame that it has to be that way, but sometimes you kind of have to start with like the basics first, and then if you get through to them, like keep chipping away at it. Whereas people who are kind of further along that journey, you can get a bit more into like the slightly more radical, like more nuanced stuff.
Yeah, I'd say from my experience as well, that including my own personal experience, that there's definitely a scale of bigotry and racism as to how radical people's views are in their racist views, or how I don't know, little radical they are. But basically, the people who consider themselves as anti-racist or not racist, but still continue to have stereotypes or still continue to say things which may be deemed as racist, or do actions which may promote racism that they're not aware about. I think if you talk to them in a diplomatic way, and they're much more open to the message because they believe in it, but they may not be completely open to all the things that they're doing to support racism. Whereas if you have someone on the other end of the scale who's an outright racist or is very bigoted in their views, then I feel that, yeah, like a more detailed argument is more compelling for them. But people are different, and people react to different things differently. So some people you're going to win through like giving information and given a lot of background, and some people you might just win through by just having a conversation, which might be very easy. But there's definitely a broad spectrum of people that we'll have to talk to and get on our side. So.
Yeah, I was gonna say it also depends on the relationship you have with the individual you're sort of trying to converse with, because you're more likely to give, say, someone you have a close relationship more flexibility to, you're gonna give them more rope to sort of express themselves, and versus say if you're with someone you've just met on the street or you're conversing online, there's no relationship there, so you're not going to give them the benefit of the doubt. They won't get as much leeway to sort of, I guess, learn. So it really depends on the relationships you have as well, and when you're trying to sort of, I guess, change people's perspectives.
I'm just curious what people think a good approach is to sort of break down the initial defensiveness that a lot of people will have, especially people that you're close with. So people that will say, you know me, you know I'm not racist, you know I'm not like that. Everyone's the same to me, I treat everyone the same, when still they have these ideals and act out in a certain way that will be promoting racism or upholding racist systems. Yeah, so just how do you think you can tackle that?
I'm not somebody who's experienced racism, but in something that was, obviously, sorry, but something that Ella mentioned earlier, and Sonia mentioned it a few weeks ago as well. It was when Sonia mentioning somebody, a customer at a shop said, didn't ask you about university, and you just broke it down saying, like, why did you think that? And I think that was something that came up in the argument, like, that, like, not just that kind of example, but just when people have a stereotype or when people have a certain view, say, about migrants or things like that, just asking why did I think that, because a lot of it, like, not valid reasons, but there's reasons there that have been, you know, from the education that they've got, from media or from, like, culture, whatever it is, though they're not justified or they're based on lies. I think still understanding why they think that is also, it, like, might be important, because to be like, why do you think that? Because then I can argue against it, because if you don't know those reasons, they're just going to potentially think somebody's just shouting at them, like, and I think that isn't okay, and those views aren't okay, but just asking why, I think, and it's mentioned in the article as well, like, can be a good approach for, like, a lot of issues.
I can't agree more. I think employing the Socratic method to any stupid argument is the first tool. But I agree again, because I think that the stance that I've always taken with this is that racism is illogical. Therefore, the anti-racist is the person with the logic in the argument, and so all one really needs to do is stay with reason and logic, which I know is difficult when facts are used in the way they are, and you can things can be twisted. But I honestly feel like if you kind of prod these arguments, and I'm not saying it should be the victims, the quote unquote victims' responsibility, but I do think that they don't hold up to any kind of questioning. They're not rigorous arguments about, and especially around the humanity of migrants. I mean, how can you really defend that while hearing yourself? You have to be a Nigel Farage or someone who's like him, who's literally getting paid to make incoherent arguments to appease the fears and the bigotry of the masses, to have that kind of argument. Or you're just so ignorant and arrogant that you're not going to change. But I think those who have the capacity to change, who we use our own reasoning to identify who those are, we can definitely quash those assumptions with just questioning and maintaining a logical and reasonable path.
Unless anyone has any burning points, I'm going to move on now to the next recommendation. Obviously, they all interlink, so we can go back to these things.
Wait. One I just want to say really quickly that the article referenced the white fragility, but which has come under a lot of criticism recently, mainly because of the incoherence. There's a white author who claims that white people can never understand the plight of people of color, but her whole job is about explaining racism. But I'm going to link that argument because it's kind of like a black Marxist take on that book, and that book was the New York Times bestseller during all the protests. So it'd be good for people to engage with the critique of that flawed literature.
Are you saying as in you want to talk about that now, or you want to link it?
I'm gonna send a link.
Oh, sorry, I didn't know whether you meant link metaphorically or like actually digitally, but
literally.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. That's a good resource. Yeah, just to say to anyone, I think there's a couple of people who've joined, but yeah, like this is just an open conversation really about the material that we recommended a while ago. So if anyone, basically, if you have anything to say about any of the talking points that we raised, just feel free to go ahead. Also, if you do want to like, if you're worried about interrupting someone, you can just post your name in the chat section or post like an emoji or something, and then I'll just make sure that we get around to like speaking to you, and then if that's an easier way, because sometimes it can be a bit kind of weird or everyone's speaking at the same time. But yeah, so yeah, the other recommendation that we had for watching was Time, the Kalief Browder story, which is on Netflix. So for anyone who has seen this, you'll know that it's like
Ella, are you frozen?
Browder, who was a
Ella. I think she's going to go out and then come back in. So if you just don't mind waiting a sec.
There she is.
What's going on?
Ella, you're on mute, babe.
Oh, I'm so sorry about that. Sorry. My phone died and I was using my phone hotspot. So, yeah, I'm extremely sorry about that. But did the whole meeting end or did I just leave?
It was just you.
Okay, cool. Sorry about that. Do you want me to summarize the thing or did I miss anything?
Oh, we didn't hear any of that. So just go from the top.
Okay, cool. So yeah, sorry about that. Right. Okay. So yeah, the Kalief Browder story. It's basically it was a 6-episode American miniseries on Netflix, recounting the story of Kalief Browder, who was a high school student from the Bronx in New York, who at the age of 16 was wrongly accused of stealing a backpack. And after he refused to plead guilty to that because he didn't do it, and also being unable to meet the $3,000 bail, he was imprisoned for 3 years, two of which were in solitary confinement in a place called Rikers Island prison, which is one of the most violent jails in America. And there he endured beating, starvation and torture, without ever actually being convicted of a crime. He was beaten by officers repeatedly, and a lot of this was caught on surveillance video, so you see that in the documentary as well. And he was eventually released, and the case was just completely like dismissed in the end. But the reason that he was there for 3 years was because there was just so many failings and so many in America, well, probably here as well, but like things just get pushed back, and there's just so much. If you don't have the money to pay for bail to get out of jail, you're likely to be there for years without even being convicted of something. So that's basically what happened to him. But unfortunately, yeah, he also suffered just a lot of really awful treatment in there as well. And basically, yeah, then after he was released, he and his family filed a lawsuit against the NYPD, but tragically, the trauma of his experiences in the jail became too much for him to bear, and he took his life in 2015. So it documents that and it kind of his mental health struggles after everything that he'd been through, and then it kind of documents all of the publicity that. Well, he gained a lot of publicity after that, but before he died, from kind of journalists and the media and celebrities, including Jay-Z, who's in the documentary, and things like that. So I think partly because of the spotlight, that became a lot of pressure to deal with as well for him. So that played into his struggles too. And yeah, one notable thing in the documentary is that as a result of his story, Barack Obama banned solitary confinement for juveniles in federal prisons. So in New York, when you're 16, you're treated as an adult. So he wasn't really technically a juvenile anyway, but anyway, yeah, after that, Barack Obama banned solitary confinement for under 18-year-olds because it obviously has a very detrimental effect on people's mental health. So yeah, that was just something that of note from the series. But yeah, that's basically the summary of it. I don't know how many people had chance to kind of see all of the episodes. There's 6 episodes, so it's quite a lot to get through, but some of you might have already been kind of familiar with his story. But yeah, do you guys want me to just kick off with like the talking points, or did anyone kind of have any general comments?
I was just going to say, I think it's probably quite important to mention that when we're talking about solitary confinement, we're not just talking about he's in his cell on lockdown for 24 hours a day. He's in his cell with people who have the power to remove his food, not feed him when they don't want to, guards that can enter his room and beat him at any time whatsoever. It's not just confined to his cell. This was hell.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I'll just kind of get going with one of the points that I kind of noted from that, which was a quote from the first episode where there was I'll have to find out her name. I didn't catch the name from the documentary, but there's a woman who is really amazing. She always says like really amazing stuff in it. But one of her quotes was that she said she was talking about basically the people in New York and other poor areas of America who are living in poverty and things like that. And she described them as the people who live just on the periphery of our imagination. And she said, we're going to have to learn to care about them. And that reminded me kind of the story which has just come to light in Glasgow about Mercy Baguma, who you guys probably have heard of, who recently passed away after basically she was an asylum seeker who kind of just slipped through the net and was failed by the system and ended up dying in Glasgow. I think it was only a few days ago, with her baby as well, who did survive but was very malnourished. And that kind of, yeah, that quote about the people who live on the periphery of our imagination in terms of like yeah, in terms of basically how can we start to really take care of the people in our society who do exist but who sometimes it's easier to imagine that they don't exist, kind of thing, or who so often get forgotten about. And I think that was the question that I wanted to ask, is like, how do we take better care of them and get them to be noticed? Like him as well. Kalief Browder was like another example of that.
Well, I think it starts by not glamorizing the kind of, I mean, I can't think of a better way, what's the way to put it, but this idea that Obama did anything good in that situation. I mean, imagine hearing that narrative and thinking, oh, I'll polish this turd, instead of actually making any kind of real change. I mean, I think I honestly, just when something this happens, you wait for the symbolic, again, performative action of a Obama type or whatever neoliberal quote unquote reformer does, that really doesn't. I mean, just when the power of that narrative, and as well as the one that you mentioned, the idea that it compels you to do anything but not and substantially change the circumstances which produced it. But knowing you have to pay lip service to it because it is so moving, to me, it's demonstrative of a political system that is at ease with this kind of suffering, but aware of the kind of emotions it can engender. But yeah, I think we should refuse to be sold by, handsome, smooth-talking politicians who occasionally do the right thing in a very small way.
Yeah, well, I was like, definitely struck by, in that documentary, it was like Obama, because I looked it up and it was like Obama bans solitary confinement, but then it was like for juveniles in federal prison, and it's like, oh right, okay, so like that's like the bare minimum that you could possibly do, like acknowledging that it's wrong to like lock up under 18-year-olds in solitary confinement. So yeah, I definitely agree with that point. But
I think, just to back that up, I think it's to shift away from like the glorification of certain acts and to continue to scrutinize. So once you realize an issue that happens, just keep thinking, okay, what next? What else can be done? Because I think you can waste a lot of energy celebrating things that really aren't going to help a lot of people, but will always like give praise to the people in power. So even if it is a black man like Obama, for example, like he's not your average black man in America. Some people don't even view him as a black man in America because he does have a lot of like proximity to whiteness and a lot of privileges of like light-skinned people. But these are all like, that kind of terminology is definitely more appropriate in like talking about America. And while colorism does exist here, wouldn't exactly think of it in the same way. But I do think you do still have to think, just because someone is a minority, we shouldn't always be celebrating what they're doing, because they still have the potential to uphold racism. And we see that in like Priti Patel, for example.
Yeah, and I think and it's a good example with Priti Patel, but I think that the Obama types are more dangerous, and not just on when you talk about his respective privilege. It's not just his fair skin, but how many. It's very rare. It's not every African American who goes to Columbia and then Harvard Law School and so on and so forth. He has a very, very unique situation, but also it's the kind of politics that we deem progressive is what we need to kind of continuously critique. And just to nail that point that you were making as well, that just not letting concessions, minor concessions, be seen as anything but distractions, because in that case it is. It may. I'm not disputing that is an objectively good thing, but it's not in any way questioning the system that produced that situation.
Yeah, I think also things like saying things like this, and as well going back to like optical activism and like performative activism, I think it can easily be spun like, oh, it's lose-lose, you never win, like it's all like depressing anyway. I think we can still be seeing like continuous progression as a positive thing, and being like excited about the future and seeing like this small thing as, you know, one step ahead. So I don't think we should completely like dismiss achievements, but I think we can view activism as a positive thing when we are seeing it as a continuous thing, because I do think a lot of people will use the excuse, or maybe just get a bit like disheartened and feel downtrodden when the work they've done doesn't feel like enough, or they don't necessarily see that other people are putting value in what they've done. But I think if we can be continuously celebrating like the community that we can create, and the fact that we're looking to uplift and improve the futures of people, I think that's a way to avoid that.
One thing I promise I'll shut up for a minute. It's just on that point. I think that the problem, and this is more to do with the actual production, and I haven't seen the last episode, but I'm assuming it ends. Did you say it ends with this, with the fact that this law is passed?
With what? Sorry.
Does the series end with the fact that this law is passed or gone?
That's part of it. That's part of it. It's not like a crescendo point where it's like.
Yeah, but it's featured in the last
Yeah.
I think that this idea of it being produced through channels like Netflix, like the Weinsteins and Jay-Z, and how radical is anything that Jay-Z is going to put out when his own wealth depends on the structure that we're talking about, and this is this kind of idea of a bourgeois kind of artistic expressions of radical politics. You have it in the theatre with Rent, which is kind of like Rage Against the Machine, but the machine is your landlord, not the U.S. government indifferent to suffering and of people. And it's the same thing you have with a lot of these Netflix documentaries. It's when they kind of show you the totality of the issue, and then have a kind of a nice kind of narrative to sum up, because that's what consumers need. But I would also say it's the kind of need to be able to tell narratives from various perspectives and channels, which don't all rely on the system that we are trying to critique. And in terms of what we are actually critiquing here, what this narrative brings to life is this idea, this kind of bit kind of Foucault-like idea that what happens behind the gates is what we don't see. And this idea of prisons were originally seen as more ethical because people aren't being hung in the streets and blah, blah, blah. But this idea that people were being hung in the streets, but if the demos saw that as being unjust, they could revolt against it because everyone saw it was in the street. But now it's behind closed doors, we don't see it. But it was seen as more ethical. And this idea that we are now seeing it through these channels, we need a channel that is uncorrupted by Weinstein, Jay-Z, Netflix, blah, blah, blah. But yeah, I'll stop talking for a minute now.
Sorry, that just made me think, because something that I struggle with a lot is kind of when you do watch these documentaries, the sensationalism kind of encompasses one individual. So you follow the narrative, you follow the story the whole way through. And I feel like for a lot of people, they watch these documentaries and they think, oh, poor Kalief, like what a poor, like I feel so sorry for him. And in their head, it's like this issue only affects that one individual because you followed their story throughout the series. Whereas you take a step back and you think, how many people does this happen to? And I feel like sometimes you lose that kind of context when it's such like an individual focus in a series. Yeah.
I have a quick question. So what avenue would you suggest for people of colour who are trying to tell these sorts of stories? Because it could be argued that YouTube, BBC, Netflix, Amazon, whatever it was, they're all sort of funneling the system.
But YouTube, not so much. I think there is a greater democratization in terms of how one can get an audience, where there's certain channel where there's a level of, I mean, YouTube's far from perfect, and I think if anyone is aware of the the issue with Stephen Crowder, and you can and many other people, you know that it's far from perfect. But with things like Netflix, you have to be in the system, or at least appeal to the system to get in it. Whereas something like YouTube, you really create your own platform. Obviously, there's various algorithms which can kind of funnel you out of the mainstream. But I would argue that one of the minor pros of social media, for all its faults, is the kind of democratization of narrative. But that's not a perfect argument. There's plenty of critiques to it in terms of what's the best avenue for marginalized narratives. I honestly don't know, but I think we can quite clearly identify the problems with a Netflix style series. And what if you watch Netflix documentaries, you know that most of them are left wing in their perspective. Most of them are anti-corruption, anti-capitalist. You know, you see much more, and in terms of other ethical issues, you see much more pro-vegan ones than you do pro-meat ones. But it's all spun in a certain way that tells which kind of creates a neat kind of thing for us to consume, but not really, that won't really enact mass kind of change because of the way the narrative's told. So I don't know fully the answer, but I know there's problems with the way that this is spun in some ways.
For people, I know Ella's just popped in the chat the Black Netflix, which I've not seen yet, so I will check out later. I do know of some basically a collection of YouTubers like LeftTube. I think is like probably how people would identify them. A lot of people who deliver like video essays and have sort of created their own platform that I think you pay something like $1.99 a month. And it's called Nebula, and it's also tied in with Curiosity Stream. So they kind of create a community on YouTube, and they've like blown up on YouTube and are able to do things like creating their own platforms and things like Patreons that I think we'll be able to continue to share those kind of things and give guidance around who like we want to support, who we suggest other people should support. But there's always the case of having like the necessary evil, you know, and even like Netflix is like a wonderful resource for a lot of things, and there's so much value in it. And I think there is sometimes a case where you do want to go down those avenues, but because when you get a certain amount of power, you can then hold them accountable. So I think trusting yourself and your beliefs, and then being able to challenge the structures you're working within, I think that's really, really important.
Yeah, definitely. And I think like it's I think we've talked about this a bit before, but like in terms of promoting things like Black-owned businesses like that, what I just posted, Black Netflix and things like that, it's like really beneficial in some ways in terms of like sort of redressing the balance in terms of kind of economic disparity and things like that. But then at the same time, you know, elevating people of colour within a capitalistic system is not necessarily the answer, and you kind of see that as well in the Kalief Browder documentary, because there's a lot of the characters in there who are like the villains, I guess, you know, the people who are partly responsible for the tragedy of his story. A lot of them are Black as well, and you see, you know, here and in America as well, there's a lot of Black politicians who I guess they get used as like a token or whatever, but actually I know that they're just as kind of, their policies are just as racist as the next white person. So this is a bit of a tenuous link to what we were just discussing, but I think that in terms of bringing it back to that, it's not, I guess it's about creating new systems rather than encouraging Black people to flourish in a system that's already so corrupt, and that is capitalism and kind of big commercial companies and things like that.
I think it goes back to what I was saying as well about like the positives of like activism being the communities you can create, because it means that you can continue to have these conversations around different platforms, and it means you can, you know, like share and like crowdsource things that make things a lot more accessible and make are able to support like the right people. So yeah, I think just continuing to have these conversations, and because a new platform is made every single day, you know, and there's always like 1,000 Kickstarters, and I think things are moving so fast that we don't need to be restricted by the things that exist now.
Yeah,
Also, I put Curiosity Stream in the chat if anyone's curious.
thank you. We can move. Well, we can move on now to the last thing, unless anyone has any other closing remarks.
Could I just add about?
Yeah.
You mentioned like when we, in terms of kind of the people on the kind of periphery of our imagination, there's a lot of performativeness in kind of reaching out to those communities as well, or reaching out to community groups who work with those communities. Like you get a lot. Well, I've only seen it in terms of homelessness, because I worked for a homeless charity in Manchester. People would like email in being like, oh, I'm doing this for uni, I really want to like help fight homelessness, and I want to come in and film like the people who like use your service. And it's like, that's not going to change the narrative, you coming in and like dictating that. Like, it's about giving people resources and making sure that they can control those narratives, and having representation in organizations, and then those things wouldn't happen in the first place. And that kind of culture of saying, I'm going to control the narrative of this, coming from mainly white privileged people, that's like a really big problem, and that's like a barrier to reaching those people, because there's that performativeness that's just embedded in culture and in helping people, or like good intentions kind of gone completely wrong, really. So yeah, but representation, I feel like has always helped me kind of understand why those things are bad, and I feel like it's like so many problems wouldn't happen if there's just representation in those organizations, particularly if they're looking to reach out to, like when you look at fashion brands and stuff, you're just like, if there's representation here, these kind of ridiculous like appropriation or just like blatantly racist things wouldn't happen. But like, because of lack of representation, they do. But it's just across every industry and organization. If it's not there, you're not going to reach those people.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry. Last thing on the documentary as well. I think one of the strengths of it was this idea of identifying time as a means of violence. And I think it's something that we definitely, you know, whenever we're late for something, we utilize the idea, well, the truism that time is a social contract, and we should, you know, recognize that in other scenarios as well, in terms of its capacity to cause harm. And Homi Bhabha talks about this in regards to immigration, and how keeping someone somewhere for a long period of time is itself an act of violence. So you know, at borders. And this is a as good an argument for good a case of this as one could find. This is, we understand various mechanisms of violence against marginalized people, but time is such a big and powerful one. I think that if there's apart from just the harrowing nature of Kalief's story, I think if this can get anything across, is how time is utilized to enact trauma.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, Ella, I just want to make one last point, and it's kind of going back to like what Rosa was saying. Basically, I work for an LGBT charity, and the amount of emails that come in like, oh, we're looking to help the LGBT, and you know, just like weird phrasing, and a lot of demands come in. And I think these kind of demands are very interesting, because they like to spin things like, oh, look at us helping you, isn't that nice of us, now give me your time. And I think this is a very important thing for people to do, like within activism, like when you're reaching out to these organizations, consider like, am I helping them? I think it's just that pausing, that thinking and reflecting is so important in so many like avenues of life, you know, but here especially because, and I said something along the lines of this earlier, but like, who are you helping? What are your intentions? And is this harmful? Is it self-indulgent? I think just reflecting on your intentions and your actions and seeing who it's truly benefiting. And I don't think it's necessarily negative if something would benefit you in some way, but I think you need to be aware of who's getting something out of it and how you can be reimbursing them. And you know, there's the classic line of like, exposure doesn't pay the bills, and that's so true and so important. And I think put aside that time to consider, if you don't have the money, how can you source that money, and what could they be getting from it? Yeah, basically.
Sorry, I'm just going to jump in really quickly. But I was just going to say, I think that's a really good point. And I think that also a lot of people are so, I'll use the word keen, but keen to help without actually understanding what they're helping. So they don't actually understand kind of the disadvantages that people face or the pitfalls in a certain system. They're just like, I'm here to help. And it's kind of like, before you offer your help, maybe take the time to kind of learn and understand what it is that you're actually helping, and then you can do it in kind of a more worthwhile and efficient way than just going in like a bull in a china shop.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah, 100%. Okay, cool. Yeah, great points there. I will just quickly move on to the last one, which is our listen recommendation. So this is a podcast called Brit (ish), which is great. And this episode was called "The Long-Lasting Racist Impact of the British Empire." And basically it's just these two young Brit (ish) women, Jeevan and Afra, who discuss issues of race and Britishness in their podcast. And basically a few of the things that they touch on in the podcast in this episode is the glorification of the British Empire, especially by, for example, like online trolls, and that's something that I've definitely witnessed a lot myself, looking at like I was looking at Priti Patel's Instagram, which I probably never have done the other day, but yeah, and just like all the comments there's so much glorification of the British Empire, especially online. So they talked about that and how that relates to kind of the white superiority complex in terms of like in terms of attitudes towards colonialism. It's like, well, we're more cultured and we're more advanced than you, and therefore you should be thankful that we have educated you and improved your living conditions, etc., etc. And you know, it's just this idea that white is superior to black, and therefore white colonialism is beneficial to anyone, when it's obviously not. So they talk about that, and they talk about kind of how the negative historical stereotypes about black people being a threat and being, you know, savages and things like that kind of feeds into this vicious cycle that exists today of black boys and black men and black women as well, but being kind of blamed for knife crime and things like that, and then also kind of relating to the war on drugs, and how the impact of the British Empire kind of leads to this vicious cycle of like, you know, obviously people of colour are at an economic disadvantage due to colonialism, therefore there are probably higher rates of crime within those communities because, you know, for the purpose of people trying to survive, and then they're faced with a racist criminal justice system, and you know, that all feeds into kind of the disproportionate rates of people of colour in prisons and things like that, and unfair judicial processes. And then they also kind of had an interesting conversation about the arguments that people who are part of kind of like the white working class might make about racism, and how maybe people who are disadvantaged white people kind of can't really understand their white privilege on the basis of their own struggles. So, you know, well, I grew up on a council estate, and, you know, I was, you know, I grew up in care, so how can you call me privileged? So they discuss that, and then they discuss kind of the whole I don't see colour argument as well, and they discuss a lot of things actually. Sorry, this is nearly the end of the list, but just like also casual racism and the need for education reform as well. So it was really good. It's just like these two ladies basically, yeah, just kind of just discussing lots of different things. They've got 4 episodes, I think, so far, and yeah, I'd recommend giving them all a listen if you haven't already. But yeah. Again, I'll just kind of give anyone an opportunity to say anything if they had any like thoughts, or if not, then I will just put some talking points out there.
2 things, and I'll try and be uncharacteristically terse. See how it goes. One thing I think is I don't think we had one meeting where we haven't talked shit about Priti Patel, and that's definitely something to keep up. I mean, I think that's as a tradition, if anything now. I didn't particularly care for the podcast. I didn't get much from it, and I don't think the links were made that I expected from the title. I expected some, not just kind of commentary on the commentary, kind of a bit of debunking, and the only kind of idea I got from it was the one that you mentioned of kind of cultural relativism, which is an important point to make. But I think if when one's critiquing the British Empire, you can do much more than that, and especially when you're relating it to the present. I was expecting to hear about the immigration acts of the 60s and the 70s, which restricted Commonwealth migration. That's a lasting thing. The bid to keep Britain white after decolonisation. And the political norms by both Labour and Conservative parties, and before it ended the Liberal Party. That's what I kind of expected, and I think needed, because I mean, I don't recommend you read Niall Ferguson's shit, but the arguments made for the British Empire are compelling for those who want to hear it. And I don't know if anyone else has wasted their time reading *Sapiens*, but that's very apologetic and of empire, and so there is a need to make compelling arguments of why, not of just why it's bad, the realities of it. That's all it is. It's the historical realities of it, and the kind of post-coloniality that we need to talk about when we're talking about legacy. So it didn't do much for me. And I don't think it made a compelling argument for anyone who either went in it against the notion, or who was ambivalent on empire, or who really didn't have a kind of an idea of what happened and its legacies.
I would probably agree as well. I think I appreciate the fact that because it wasn't so academic, I don't know if that's the right use of the word, but yeah, so it made it a bit easier to digest, I guess. But I didn't really get anything out of it that I think the average person with even a little bit of knowledge regarding race or critical race theory already knew, like talking about things like white passing, white privilege, but not really going into the historical or the cultural context of them.
Sorry, should we define white passing?
Oh, okay. So I can't remember which one, but I think it was one who said that she was half Indian. She was explaining how because she's fairer skinned, she identifies as a person of colour because she's biologically a person of colour, but because she is so fair, to the average person looking at her, she is white passing. So therefore, a lot of the microaggressions and overt racism that people of darker skin will experience, she's sort of saved from. And she briefly went into the complexities and how that makes her feel, but I think it would have made for a better discussion if she explained the cultural significance of that, like within Indian culture and within being an immigrant in Britain. Yeah, that I just think it was a bit brief. Like they covered a lot of topics, but not in a lot of detail.
I actually was a bit taken by a similar point, because I was just thinking, as a white passing person, would you not? This is just more of a open question, but I was thinking, would she not actually experience more racism because people may feel more comfortable to air their racist thoughts or ideologies in front of her, because not knowing that she actually was a person of colour. And I thought that was quite a gaping hole in what she was saying.
I
think for her it would probably... Oh, sorry.
Oh, it's okay, you can go.
I guess that is her personal experience, so I can't speak for that. But...
All I was going to say is that maybe her experience is similar to that of someone like Mariah Carey, who, if you know her parental background, you know that she has black in her. But to the outside world, you can't see that. So because race is a social construct, a lot of your experience as a person of colour is based on people looking at you and going, oh, you're a person of colour. So if you don't outwardly look like a person of colour, then I guess maybe she doesn't experience a lot of the racism that, say, I would or Lupita would or something.
I think Georgia, what you're getting is, are you getting at a point that maybe should be privy to more racialized? It's not so much.
Okay, sorry, I misunderstood.
Yeah, sorry, I should have made myself a bit more clear. Kane pretty much cleared it up, but what I mean is, as somebody who is white passing, surely in situations, I guess it depends. It also depends on who she's surrounding herself with. But I feel like in some situations, a white passing person is more likely to hear some comments or whatever, because people are not aware that they're a person of colour, and so they feel comfortable airing these thoughts in front of them.
Yeah.
And I thought that was kind of missing from her argument. But again, if she hasn't experienced that, she hasn't experienced that, so I can't speak for her. But I found that quite interesting, because I'd always assumed that would more so be the case.
Yeah, I think there's a big rhetoric that, like, you know, like white passing is basically white and like you're not included in the conversation. But I do agree that that is like a big challenge you can come up against. And you're understanding that, like, they're talking about your family, and it's things like I don't look gay, so I've come across people who have said like homophobic things and then are shocked, and then even in that moment it's kind of their homophobia, like the weight of that has gone away, because now the situation is about the fact that they just can't believe it, you know. And I think that exists in white passing people a lot, and like there is that comfort, and especially if, say, because you're white passing because you're mixed, for example, and so you're more likely to have like a privileged life where you are surrounded by maybe like people of like a higher social class, or like a more advantaged socioeconomic backgrounds, and that means that people are holding particular beliefs and have very different experience to maybe what like your grandparents had, and it's so distant, like your lifestyle is so distant from that of your grandparents, but you still carry that generational trauma, and yeah, you're exposed to that racism and then almost dismissed in a lot of like circles and in a lot of like conversations and arguments, like your experience isn't understood, and I think that's like super isolating. And I think when you don't exist in binaries, you're always going to have that sense of isolation and a sort of suppressed struggle.
Yeah, definitely. And I think on one of the points that you raised there, it came into my head, but I don't know how I'm going to link it. But basically, like, in terms of, oh yeah, so you said about like how maybe if you were mixed race or something, you might have like you might have family members or whoever that are more likely to be more privileged or advantaged socioeconomically, etc. And basically one of the things that struck me in the podcast was obviously they were talking about a little bit about how kind of the British Empire has resulted in people of colour being economically disadvantaged, and obviously that is true, and it's so important for that to be acknowledged. So I think one of them, I actually quite liked the quote that one of them said about like if you went to a doctor, they would ask you about your medical history and your past. They wouldn't just ignore it, and because that's important in terms of your current kind of status and health. So that was kind of a good analogy I thought from that. But basically what I was thinking about was like a problem that I kind of have in terms of talking about race is that how do we kind of acknowledge white supremacy and white privilege, especially when you're talking to race about talking about race with children, without kind of risking encouraging people of color to kind of internalize the idea that they are lesser, or they are, because obviously like there's a balance between, obviously like the reality is that people of color are more likely to be a lot more socioeconomically disadvantaged, but at the same time it's like it gets kind of disheartening at some point to have people constantly this. I'm envisioning one day in an education system where people are told the truth about the situation in race. Like how do we prevent that from being really disheartening to young black children who think, oh, like, do you know what I mean, like I don't stand a chance kind of thing. So yeah,
I don't think you can separate the two, as sad as that sounds, because I think for a lot of black people out there, the black experience is pain. It has pain either one way or another. And I think, especially if you are someone who won't benefit from light skin privilege, it's not going to do you any favors living in this make-believe world. But at the same time, I don't know, because I know some people who are parents, and they sort of just, I think a lot of black people, brown people have heard the phrase, you know, you can't do this, like you have to try twice as hard than they do. I know I definitely had that when I was younger. There are certain things that you can't do. And I know I have cousins in London, like boy cousins in London, they definitely heard similar things. And it's just one of those things, especially if you grow up around white people, that it's like, oh, like, you can try and shoplift, but just know that if you get caught, it might end up differently for you. And like, obviously you'd like to live in this world where you'd be treated fairly because you're a child too, but that's just not the reality. So I think even though you risk making them jaded and think, oh, that's really unfair, it's better that they at least have that in mind, in my opinion.
I don't think it's so much about if I'm understanding your question correctly, that is, Ella, it's not so much about hiding realities, it's about making the narrative so that they don't internalize the lies of white supremacy. And I would argue that the dialogue that they at least claim to engage with is the way to do it. But I would take it slightly differently and utilize the voices of the anti-colonial struggle. So like and that's why it's frustrating that Caribbean philosophy is not a part of you know, our kind of what we consume on a regular basis. But this idea, Fanon's idea, not so much of white supremacy, but of white insecurity, and that whiteness required an other that it was superior to. And this idea works with heteronormativity as well. That the insecurity of heteroness, so to speak, required an other that it could be superior to. And I think this requirement to be superior speaks to your own insecurity. And so utilizing those kinds of ideas where the need to be superior is itself the problem would be a better way of exposing the kind of imperial lie that we are sold or like, well, that was and is continued to be peddled. And I think that they broach the topic with the ideas of cultural relativity about how certain cultures can't be critiqued from the outside, which I think can only go so far. We can't talk. I think that I hope it's agreed upon that we can't talk about morals in the same way. But I think they do that to a certain degree there. But I think we need to utilize Caribbean philosophy, which was built in the crucible of white supremacy.
Yeah, I think the overarching problem with the podcast was just that the topic that they were discussing relies a lot on facts and statistics, and they just didn't really have any to back up, because there was a lot of historical factors that they didn't go into when talking about the poor quality of education in the UK when learning about the history of former colonies prior to Western imperialism. That would have been good to include things like how Arabic civilizations developed early mathematics and astrology, like just even those things, like you don't even really know anything about it, but that would get the point across better, as opposed to just saying, yeah, the education system doesn't teach you anything. Next topic.
I was going to say, I think that I think I'm going slightly back more to like the question at base level, but I feel like I'm sure so many of us on this call have had the talk that Sonia mentioned, like you're going to have to work twice as hard, or as my dad likes to say, 10 times as hard. But I think the real, like, obviously that is the reality, and I don't think that that's something that when lots of us have children, we're still going to have that conversation with our kids. But I feel like something that is missing is actually being educated on your own history and the successes in your own history. And as like Sonia mentioned, like for example, if you go onto Instagram, you can find posts full of, we wouldn't have any of these household items without Black women. Black women invented these household items. And it's that, especially when it comes to speaking to children, especially, I wish that's something that I had that education from a younger age. I think I grew up knowing that I was, say, viewed as inferior, but I didn't grow up a bit internalizing that, thinking I am inferior. But I feel what would have helped me further on the journey is to have for a larger emphasis to be placed on kind of the light in what it means to be Black or be of the Black community, rather than focusing solely. And I'm not taking away from the fact that we do need to know where these disadvantages are and how this impacts us negatively. But I feel like there's such an importance that should be placed on. It's like when people talk about bringing Black curriculum into schools, and everyone's thinking, oh great, so kids are going to learn about the slave trade in more detail. It's like Black history did not start at the slave trade. Like there's such a wealth of history and a wealth of successes that I feel like so many of us just didn't know from such a young age. And I feel like that's something that can really kind of instill like a sense of pride, but also kind of confidence in a young child that I feel like a lot of us may have been missing, because it's not talked about so much. We tend to talk about the negatives, which are important, but I do think that's something that's missing. I don't know, what do you guys think?
If I could just butt in, yeah, I strongly agree with that. I'd say growing up of Indian descent and going to India firsthand when I was a little kid, obviously being schooled in the UK and learning a little bit about empire, you kind of go to your native country and you think, oh, like we're so poor, and we have so many poor people, and we don't have this, and we don't have infrastructure, we don't have that. And that's because of the way we've always been, or like this country was always like that. And it wasn't until like the British people came over and helped us build trains and helped us do this that we developed all of that. Obviously, like that's what I knew when I was a kid. But when I grew up and I learned about India before the British colonization happened, you learn about how the colonization took so much from us, and how wealthy we were before, and how important we were before, and how much of a powerhouse we were in the medieval time before the British people came. that you think, wow, like we were so amazing then, and our history is so amazing that we were capable of doing all these things, and we weren't less than them, and we weren't uncivilized, and we weren't, you know, any lesser of people. We had our own greatness, and we had our own history. And the same with African history as well, like, and Black history as well. If you read about it, if you read about ancient Egypt, if you read about all the, like, the Empire of Mali, and you read all about African history as well, and there's tons of it, you do appreciate the fact that, you know, people of color, we do have amazing histories. We do have the capabilities to do everything that we were taught that we weren't able to do, or that we were educated that we weren't able to do, which whole kind of gives this colonialism, you know, the right to happen when it basically was all lies about that. So I think that's super important, and that's made me feel very proud about my history. And I wish I had known that earlier as well, because I was kind of ashamed of my history, because I thought we didn't accomplish anything really until the British people came over, which is obviously complete false.
I remember when I was younger. So my mom is half Jamaican, half Ghanaian, full Black. But and I remember the first time I met someone like from Ghana, like who had like come to England for school, and I like a full asked her if they had McDonald's in Ghana, because to me that was such like you can't have that, because all the images of Africa, and I mean Africa like with no distinguishing between the countries, just Africa. I saw like, you know, kids with flies on their faces, like in adverts with sad music, and like there wasn't much else. So yeah, so to go from that to being taught like Black history and it just being whittled down to that, and then also having no nuance, because we speak about people of color and Black people interchangeably, when there's like a plethora of like cultures and diasporas like in the UK that like we need to be acknowledging, celebrating, and yeah, like giving them their moment and supporting and like telling people their true stories. And because all these like complex like narratives that we're told, and we're taught such bullshit that doesn't matter, that doesn't impact our lives, and doesn't really truly give us more understanding of like the current landscape. And like, you know, I don't know, like when I left school I didn't know anything about India or Africa or, you know, or China, and then now all the things that I'm being fed about China, and rather than I'm learning in my own time and in my own research, everything popping up about that is completely negative. And, you know, like China's doing this, China's brainwashing their population, and like we're not having the exact same thing happen to us. And yeah, I feel like it's not just that our history is erased, it's that we're painted in certain ways. So like we're the bad guys, or we're the poor ones, or, you know, there's no positivity there, despite having so much like spirit, community, and culture to like really embrace.
Just on the kind of the last 3 points made, I was wondering what people think. How can we do that without, you know, using the master's tools? Because, you know, historical histories like the way we're taught the British Empire, we can. I think that sometimes, and it's not like I disagree with anything that anyone said at all, and I agree with it, and it's part of what I do as someone who studies history. How do we avoid romanticizing, you know, certain, especially you have it with certain historical racialized narratives, with romanticizing certain things to a degree where they are used in the same way that Europeans have taught empire, and we don't want to kind of make out that, you know, these and it's like whenever I do a lot of teaching on transatlantic slavery, and I always have to have this big discussion about the realities of African slavery, which is nowhere near like European slavery. But it's always I always have to debunk the romantic, as well as the kind of glorification of empire, the kind of romanticism that comes with the resistance to that. So I was wondering if anyone had any good ideas about how we have a kind of pedagogical practice of debunking empire, the glorifying of empire and the kind of white narrative of history, the great man history, while sticking to what is our friend, the historical accuracy, without romanticizing, any kind of racialized narratives from a political standpoint.
Pan-African schools.
Sorry, what did you say?
Pan-African schools, like anywhere where there is a community of marginalized groups. I like the idea of pooling resources together, and if the schools aren't going to teach your kids properly, then you teach your kids.
I mean more about how do we avoid a counter narrative which doesn't reflect the meta narrative just with an ethnic garb. Does that make sense?
I don't know.
I just meant as in the, oh, go on.
No, Sonia, you go, it's all you.
Oh no, it's okay.
Why do we always do this every week?
I'll probably agree with you anyway, so go on.
No, I was just going to say that I don't have an answer. I wish I had an answer. But I feel like something that always stuck with me from a very young age is someone once said to me, history is written by the winners. And that was something that it's like a catchy phrase, so it stays in your mind, whatever. And it wasn't until I was slightly older that I started to kind of think more into it. And obviously, yes, just knowing that what you're being fed is not necessarily the truth, or it's one white man's truth. It doesn't fix the issue and it doesn't teach us what we need to know, but I think it's definitely a starting block of even from a young age being kind of improving critical thinking and being taught to question what you hear and what you're taught in school. I know that goes against everything that you're taught in school, and it's your teacher's word is law, that's it. You're there to be seen and not heard, etc. But I feel like it's so important to know that, and I don't know how you go about that without uprooting an entire system, because that is the education system. You learn these things, you're tested on them, then you succeed and go off the rest of your life. But like being told history is written by the winners, what about the people that didn't win? What's their story? Where's their story? Was something that kind of led me to question from a younger age than I would have, if that makes sense. But sorry.
No, I was going to say I think that's I think that if there is an answer, it would be critical faculties. I completely agree with that. It's just that you just don't want to basically put a kind of you don't want to switch the narrative, and I thought that there is a tendency to do that. I've noticed, and it's not. I don't think it's our friend by using the master's tools. So
I think it also just makes us uncomfortable, because it's kind of human nature to want to label things, put things into categories, see things in black and white. And that's why people struggle, because especially, I know I said this before, but with the schooling system and the way that you're examined and tests, etc., it's like there's a right and a wrong answer. And I feel like it's really difficult to accept that sometimes there is no right or wrong answer, and there's a lot of nuance, and I think I don't have the answers, but I feel like it's something that's really, it's quite hard to take once you realize that, because you feel a bit lost.
Yeah, so you can find the situation where there would be someone claiming that William Wilberforce ended slavery, and then someone would come along, well, actually no, Toussaint Louverture ended slavery. And I'm not saying one's definitely more wrong than the other one, but this idea of kind of making history into neat historical racialized narratives that suit our preference is not, I don't think is the remedy. Not like anyone said it was, but I think that's that can be the knee-jerk reaction of some movements in this case.
Yeah, I'd say like having two narratives definitely help, because obviously if we're taught only one narrative growing up, which is very one-sided, it's very inaccurate and false. But having two opinions and two narratives, even though they might be like from the different ends of the scale, and having the counter narrative, gives you like two perspectives of what's happened. And with everything in life, there's so many sources, so many pieces of information, so many things you'll read. You kind of have to make up your mind and think, okay, like maybe this happened and this happened. So it might be something in between. And that's obviously something that you learn growing up. But I think definitely having the counter narrative helps to understand things in a more balanced way. But I completely agree with you that some of those counter arguments are using the same tools and can be quite dangerous as well. Like if you read a lot of this nationalistic stuff which goes against empire, it can make you feel very angry and very resentful of what's happened, to the point where you might become, outwardly racist against white people because of what their history is. So yeah, I definitely agree with you. But I think having two sides definitely helps, because you can just kind of take bits of information from both sides that you think might fit the narrative and then make your own mind up.
I think something that you see in like say like a GCSE level of something like history or classics, there'll be a module that's on the role of women, which it feels kind of ridiculous right now, but I guess that didn't exist however long ago, and that module will hopefully at some point become obsolete. So maybe the next step is like the role of the working class, the role of minorities, or like experiencing that from like their perspective, understanding their perspective. And I think it often taught like the top down rather than like the grassroots. And there's value in understanding how both of those worked, so you can analyze what was beneficial to like society as a whole and where like the errors come in.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's sometimes it's a problem of sources. I mean, and initially especially with slavery in the US, there was a reliance on sources by masters, so diaries and stuff like that, which painted a particular like a benevolent system. And then when more radical historians started using stuff like slave narratives by abolitionists and stuff like that, and then archaeological excavations of slave culture, completely transformed our thinking. So I definitely agree. It's about perspectives and putting forward as many as possible and seeing the difference. And in terms of empire, you could see how an empire be profitable for would be a good thing for those profiting from it who don't care about the human rights abuses. But then if you presented the experience of the colonized, you may as a student think slightly differently about it.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
No, you go.
I was just going to say, like, if you've read *Sapiens* as well, like, the author there makes a lot of positive points for empire, and for someone like me, and I'm sure a lot of you people would agree, of having, a different background than a British or a white background, that it makes you feel quite uncomfortable to know that there were advantages of empire, and not just for the people who owned empire, but for modern day society, about trade, about communication, about all the stuff that we benefit from today. So I think having a balanced view of those stuff is very important as well, as uncomfortable as it is.
I would just say that I just disagree on the point. I think all of on the topic of *Sapiens*, I think Harari's points, pro-empire points, are all from a perspective of what was European being good. So I don't agree with the idea that there was positivity. This idea that train tracks for what, and hospitals for what, for the diseases brought. I mean, so I understand that he makes them all from a very kind of macro history, which requires him to make certain assumptions and conclusions. But I don't agree with the point that his ideas of the positives of empire are valid, and macro historians are shit, and he's an example of that, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think what I take away from like this conversation, which has had many good points, is that, like, I suppose in answer to my original like talking point about how do we kind of talk about white privilege without making people of colour feel inferior and things like that, I guess it's kind of coming back to what we always seem to come back to, well, or what I always seem to come back to about like anti-capitalism and stuff, is that like obviously the British Empire was, you know, when we talk about the successes of it, all that is really talking about is in monetary terms, and also when we talk about people of colour being disadvantaged, that is basically within the structure of capitalism, and I guess changing whilst obviously acknowledging that living in poverty and not having money in this system is massively damaging to people's physical and mental health, obviously. Well, I think we need to acknowledge that, and also, you know, make sure that children know that that is the reality, but then also, I suppose, through creating new sort of ideas about what success means and who really like what you guys were talking about earlier about the winners and the losers of empire and things like that. I guess changing the way that we think about that in terms of, like, you know, winning and losing shouldn't always just be about you know, I know it wasn't always just about money in empire. You know, there were wars and stuff that were like physically you have to win or lose a war, but ultimately it does all come down to who has made, you know, countries profited the most and things like that, and it still does. So I guess teaching children and adults as well that, like, there is so much more to sort of personal wealth than just monetary wealth, and then so that children, I guess, can, and then showing, you know, overcome the difficulties that they've had to face within this system of capitalism. So I suppose that's kind of encouraging, but also realistic at the same time. That's just my thoughts. Yeah, but yeah, so we've gone a bit over time. So did anyone else have anything else to say before we close off?
Can people fill out the form that I'm about to put in the chat if you haven't already? Thank you so much. That's it.
Cool. Okay, well, thanks so much. Oh yeah, yes. Kane, do you want to say the thing about race and class, or do you want me to do it?
Really quickly, on September the 10th, the next event will be having a kind of it will be a first in a series of events about race and class, and so understanding the kind of intersectional dialogue and narrative, and how we can kind of better talk about class as an anti-racial organisation, and as kind of the politics. It'll be much more of a discussion than anything else. It would just be kind of getting people's thoughts on the position of class in an anti-racist organisation, how much to talk about, how much we should talk about it. So it'd be good to see all of you there, and if you know anyone who'd be interested, please send them the details.
Thank you very much. And yeah, thanks everyone for coming, and have a great weekend. It's the weekend that would have been Notting Hill Carnival this weekend, so hope you all raise a glass of rum punch to nod to that, because obviously I wanted to, yeah, it's a sad weekend for me, because it's my literally favorite time of the year, and it's obviously a very prominent event for the Caribbean community, and I think it's an event which brings so many people in London and the rest of the country together. So and obviously it's kind of a bit of a fuck you to, because I know it kind of sorry, this is a bit of a tangent, but I was reading recently about how it kind of came about in the 70s and 80s, where obviously it was when you were black or a person of colour, it was difficult to get into nightclubs, so people were just like, well, fuck you, we're going to make a party on the streets and you can't stop us, and it hasn't been stopped apart from this year because of Corona. But yeah, so if there's some good documentaries and podcasts and stuff about Notting Hill Carnival, so I would recommend giving them a watch or a listen over the weekend if you can, and yeah, we'll catch you at the next event, and thanks everyone so much for all your valuable contributions. Oh my god, that is so cringe. I don't know why I did that. Thanks. Bye, guys.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Bye. Thanks. Thank you. Bye.